These warriors of the Imperium are the staunch defenders of humanity, possessing superhuman capabilities given to them by a harsh regime of genetic modification, psycho-conditioning, and rigorous training. The Space Marines, or Adeptus Astartes, are forged for battle, sent to the front lines clad in their ancient power armor and wielding the most potent weapons of the Imperium of Man. They are the Emperor of Mankind's first and last line of defense. But what are the origins of these devout warriors? Why were they created in the first place, and how have they evolved over the 10 millennia since their creation? The origins of the Space Marines can be traced all the way back to the Age of Strife, a dark and turbulent period in mankind's history beginning in M25, long before the Imperium was actually formed. The government of Old Earth had collapsed, leaving the planet lawless and at war with itself as survivors fought for scraps of ancient technology. Astropathic communication had failed due to ever-growing warp storms sweeping across the galaxy, meaning the Sol system was entirely cut off from the neighboring systems it had colonized. The planet had descended into one apocalyptic battlefield, fractured by conflict and divided up by city-states and warlords of rival techno-barbarian tribes. This period of total anarchy would last for thousands of years, until in the late 29th millennium, a mysterious figure would rise to once again wrest control over the fate of mankind. Known only as the Emperor, he would enter the fold with one single all-encompassing goal, and that was unity. To accomplish this, he would undertake the Unification Wars, where he would ultimately conquer the various warring factions across Terra, establishing direct rule over the planet and its people. To accomplish this great feat, the Emperor would require a new breed of warrior, genetically enhanced to be stronger, faster, and more resilient to adverse environmental factors. They would be known as the Thunder Warriors and would form the building blocks of what we now know as the Astartes. Throughout the course of the Unification War, the Thunder Warriors would claim many victories for the Emperor, often facing an adversary who was entirely unprepared to fight such a strong foe. Once the war had been won, however, the Emperor knew that his new creations could not be allowed to survive. These early prototypes differ from contemporary Space Marines in that they were created from fully grown adults and were not purged of their human emotions. This meant their bodies and minds were far less receptive to the genetic modifications and augmentations needed to forge them into the superhuman machines of war that they became. This rejection of the changes being made to their bodies would lead to extreme mental and physical instability, making them susceptible to fits of bloodlust and suited only to the single-minded task of waging war. This was well known by the Emperor by the time the Unification War was coming to its end, so as victory drew ever closer, he called a stop to replacing their numbers. At the final battle of the war, the Emperor would take decisive action to ensure that the Thunder Warriors would not survive. Many were lost in this great battle, and while the Imperial records suggest that all of the Thunder Warriors were lost in this event, the rumors were many that the Emperor had actually used this battle as an opportunity to deploy his custodian guard and cull any left among the Thunder Warriors' ranks. Few survivors escaped to tell this tale after the culling, and some would even side with renegade Imperial forces to fight back in an event called the Palace Coup. This dissident uprising was left utterly crushed by the first mass deployment of thousands of new prototype Astartes who formed the first legion of the newborn Space Marines. They would come to be known as the Dark Angels and would be one of the 20 Space Marine legions formed during the first founding, engineered from the Emperor's very own genetic code. The earliest of these newly created Space Marines were handpicked from the Emperor's personal bodyguard. These volunteers would go through much of the same physical and mental transformations as the Thunder Warriors before them, but by this point hard lessons had been learned, and they would also go through stringent mental and physical conditioning to ensure that they would not suffer the same rapid degeneration as their predecessors. Once the process of creating these new soldiers had been refined, the Emperor would begin creating them in much greater numbers, splitting them up into 20 regiments of a few hundred warriors each. Although not known to many at this time, this segmentation was no coincidence. In order to protect his legacy, the Emperor created the Primarchs, his 20 genetically engineered sons, formed within a secret underground laboratory on Terra using forbidden sciences and arcane lore derived from the warp itself. The Emperor would use his own DNA to create the Primarchs in his image. They were far superior to humans in every single way. Stronger, faster, more intelligent, and even more charismatic on account of being destined for leadership within the Imperial military. They were each given their own purpose and speciality, meaning they could fulfill specific functions required by the Emperor in his quest to unify the galaxy. Each Primarch's genetic material would be used in the creation of one of the 20 newly formed regiments of Space Marines. This resulted in them taking on various characteristics and traits associated with their patron Primarch. As time passed, these once small regiments of a few hundred warriors would grow into vast legions as the Emperor recruited young men from the newly conquered tribes of Terra. The numbers of Astartes would swell from hundreds into tens of thousands, and these superhuman troops would be used to subjugate any remaining city-states or tribes that attempted to remain independent if diplomacy failed. These newly formed legions would not have the individual character that we know today. Instead, they would be clad in thunder armor forged from the recycled remains of equipment worn by their previously conquered foes. These suits of armor would be left a uniform grey with the Emperor's thunder and lightning sigil fixed to one pauldron and a numeral depicting which of the 20 legions the warrior belonged to on the other. Over time, these legions would develop their own identity and flair, be given names either by the Emperor or their Primarch, and this would lead to them developing their own sigils and color schemes to match their new designations. The Grey Legions would, as a result, slowly fade away. The influence of the Primarchs on the newly created Astartes did not end with their gene seed and their heraldry. Going back for a moment to the creation of the Primarchs themselves, deep within the gene laboratories on Terra, a huge warp vortex would spirit the Primarchs away from their mother, Urda, a perpetual who had combined her own genetic material with that of the Emperor's to create them, and into the warp while still within their gestation capsules. They would travel through the immaterium to worlds all across the galaxy, the hands of the dark gods of chaos pulling the strings. Given enough time, they would each be found by Imperial expeditionary fleets during the Emperor's Great Crusade, but there is a great level of speculation that the Chaos Gods managed to somehow tamper with the infant Primarchs. Once found, the Space Marine legions would often adopt the planet their Primarch was located on as their base of operations, seeing their progenitor as their natural leader. If the planet had a suitable population, it would often become a nursery world for the Legion, where they would reap initiates and servants from the human population to grow their numbers, whereas those without a suitable homeworld would be given permission to draw fresh blood from other worlds with incredibly harsh conditions conquered during the Great Crusade. Those who could survive on such planets were more likely to make for suitable recruits. Now separated from Terra, the legions would begin forming their own internal cultures as they recruited from new populations. This could be as simple as a new pattern of speech, a change of tactics, or as in the case of the Space Wolves and Dark Angels, a dramatic shift in their way of life, traditions, and even ideology. This deviance from their founding culture would lead some of the First Legions to ultimate damnation, with some completely stricken from the Imperial records and others seen as traitors to the Emperor. The rapid expansion of the Imperium through the galaxy would reveal a fatal flaw with the creation of these new Space Marines. The gene seeds that were created before the scattering of the Primarchs were beginning to degrade and become unstable. The increasing demand for new Astartes due to the ongoing attrition of the Great Crusade meant that these gene seeds were being drastically overused, and without any way to refresh and rebuild them, the creation of new Space Marines would soon become dangerous, risking similar instability seen in the Thunder Warriors. Relenting the pace of the Great Crusade's progress was not an option for the Emperor, so he employed a secret conclave of gene wrights who developed Grabea's theorem. This demonstrated that a Primarch's genetic code could be used to stabilize and expand the failing gene seed stocks with what they hoped would be minimal deviation. Along with this newly developed technique, they would use genetic technologies taken from the Selenar gene cults of Luna, reducing the processing time required required to create battle-worthy Space Marines to as little as a Terran year. Along with these accelerated methods, the psycho-indoctrination process would either be removed, reduced, or in contrast, overly forceful, and this would lead to a series of unforeseen, fundamental flaws in the Space Marines created during this time period. These flaws would soon start to cause issues for the Emperor as the sanity and psychological makeup of certain legions began to degrade, leading to horrors that still haunt the Imperium in M41. At the height of the Emperor's Great Crusade, the loyalty of the Space Marines would begin to unravel. Primarchs and their legions would begin to fall into the clutches of Chaos gods and stand openly as traitors to their creator. The War Master Horus would lead 9 heretic legions in a 7-year-long campaign of terror that would see hundreds of worlds burned in the name of the Chaos gods. This period was of course known as the Horus Heresy. Although the result of this long and bitter war amongst the Astartes legions would ultimately be victory for the Emperor and the death of Horus, it would come at a monumental cost, leaving a gaping wound in the Imperium and the remaining legions of the Adeptus Astartes. The Emperor was mortally wounded in his final battle with the traitor Horus, his wound so severe that he would be permanently incapacitated and condemned to a life attached to the Golden Throne, which had been adapted to become a horrific life support system. To drive the traitors from the Imperium, the remaining loyalist legions would enact the Great Scouring, in which they would force the traitorous Primarchs and their forces to flee into the Eye of Terror. There, these traitor sons of the Emperor would give themselves over to the forces of Chaos entirely and become Daemon Princes, serving each of the Chaos gods directly with their corrupted legions of Chaos Space Marines. Those left would have to pick up the pieces and rebuild in the Emperor's name, continuing the fight against Chaos and finishing his Great Crusade. Once it was clear that the Emperor could no longer actively rule over the Imperium, Rabute Guilliman, Primarch of the Ultramarines, became the Empire's day-to-day ruler. He would lead during the period known as the Reformation, in which he reshaped the very core of the Imperium's government. He created a council, the High Lords of Terror, who would then, under Guilliman's guidance, lay out the structure of the Adeptus Terror, who would be responsible for the governance of all of the Imperium's conquered worlds. Guilliman would then go forward to reorganize the Imperium's military, codifying the structure of the Imperial Guard, the Imperial Navy, and the Space Marines. For the Space Marines, he would create a great tome of military organization, strategy, and tactics that would become the Codex Astartes. This document would shape the Adeptus Astartes in Guilliman's image of good morality, structure, and tactics, in the hope that a concrete set of rules would prevent another civil war like the Horus Heresy. First and foremost, the speed at which Space Marines could be created was dramatically slowed. Guilliman believed that the accelerated gene seed cultivation process used to keep the Space Marines up to strength during the early part of the Great Crusade was directly responsible for the forces of Chaos being able to exploit the traitors' physical and mental corruption. To prevent this, the gene banks used to create new Astartes would be carefully monitored and scrutinized, so any defects would be caught and eliminated before being used to create new troops, and young aspirants would undergo stringent trials of suitability before being accepted. Only those of the sternest character would go on to become Space Marines. To further protect the gene seed supply, the Adeptus Terra would set up gene banks to produce and store tithes of gene seeds. This carefully managed supply would be used in all future foundings so that the new Astartes would be created from a known physical and psychological foundation. To prevent cross-contamination, each legion's gene stock was stored separately, and the traitor legions had their gene seed placed under a time-locked stasis seal, so they would never have further descendants. A further consequence of the creation of the Codex Astartes was the restructuring of existing legions. It was decided by Guilliman that the remaining loyalists should be split into smaller, self-governing bodies of no more than 1,000 men. These would be called chapters and represent the Space Marines that you are likely familiar with today. This decision initially caused Guilliman's brother Primarchs to rally against him in fear of losing their connection and control over the warriors created in their image. However, they would eventually relent, accepting the necessity of reorganization for the sake of the Imperium's security. Each new chapter would take a homeworld or fortress monastery as their own to use as a bastion to protect the Imperium, and would also be given their own unique name and heraldry. These newly formed chapters were organized according to the structure laid out in the Codex Astartes. They would be responsible for their own recruitment, training, and equipment, and would find leaders from within their own ranks. All of this combined meant that no one man would ever be able to command the devastating power of an entire Space Marine Legion ever again. The second founding would take place 7 years after the death of Horus and would see the creation of the new chapters demanded by the Codex Astartes. One chapter from each legion would maintain the name and heraldry of the legion they originated from, while the rest created new identities. Most legions were split into fewer than 5 chapters, excluding the Ultramarines, whose sheer size meant they would need to be divided significantly more times. The oldest known copy of the Codex Astartes puts this number of divisions at 23. This significant weighting towards the Ultramarines during the second founding meant that their gene seed would quickly become the preferred genetic stock of all future foundings, owing to its increased availability during gene seed tithes. All chapters created from the Ultramarine gene seed were known as the Firstborn, or the Progenitors, and they would venerate Guilliman as their founding father and patron. The Codex Astartes would go on to be revered across the Imperium as a holy text of the Imperial cult. The chapters who rigidly follow its word are referred to as Codex chapters, and considered the structure laid out in the tome to be the only allowable model for their organization, culture, and tactical doctrine. One of the most famous Codex chapters are of course the Ultramarines themselves, who treat the word of their Primarch as if it were willed by the Emperor itself. The Adeptus Terra has never decreed it necessary to enforce the Codex absolutely, even if it could. However, it is likely that, along with its increased availability, the Ultramarines gene seed is widely chosen during foundings, as it has produced many Codex chapters in the same law-abiding vein as the Ultramarines, significantly lowering the chance of the chapters becoming renegades, or worse, being seduced by the power offered by chaos. It is believed that out of the thousands of chapters that exist in the 41st millennium, more than a third are descendants of the Ultramarines. In the 10 millennia since the Horus Heresy, there have been a number of long periods of rebellion and anarchy across the empires of mankind. It is during these periods where many of the Space Marine foundings were carried out to bolster the fighting capabilities of the Imperium's forces. From this division of the original Loyalist legions, a force that is just about large enough to defend Imperium sectors from the enemies of mankind has been forged. Most of these chapters are loyal servants of the Emperor and follow the word of Guilliman and the Codex, while still venerating the Primarchs from which their gene seed originates. However, some have taken a different path, such as the Black Templars and Space Wolves. Owing to certain gene seed quirks, they have developed their own internal structure, tactics, and heraldry, and although still loyal, do not adhere to the Codex as strictly, sometimes not at all. During the closing years of the 41st millennium, a new breed of Astartes was created, given the name of the Primaris Space Marines. These warriors are given an additional set of implants above those that have been the standard for so many years that make them bigger, stronger, and able to heal significantly faster than their older counterparts. However, the process of building this new breed of warrior has not been the work of a single moment. In the aftermath of the Horus Heresy, Guilliman would charge Archmagos Dominus Belisarius Call with creating a new legion that would aid the Imperium in its darkest hour, equipping him with the Sang Primus Portum, an artifact containing the genetic material of all of the 20 Primarchs. For the next 10,000 years, Call's formula would be developed, tested, and refined, until during the 13th Black Crusade, with the Imperium on the brink of annihilation, his new breed of Space Marine would be unleashed to fight the Chaos Hordes of Abaddon the Despoiler. These warriors of the Imperium have a long and storied history, born from the necessity of a turbulent and ruptured humanity who could not agree on a single path forward. They have been adapted, reimagined, and rebuilt over millennia, affected by countless unforeseen complications and subject to some of the harshest trials the human mind could comprehend. Now, forged by the experience and mistakes of their ancestors, the chapters of the Adeptus Astartes wait to be deployed to defend the Imperium and its people from their next threat, whether it be from within or without.